Welcome to Blade Sharpening Fundamentals. I'm Murray Carter, owner of Carter Cutlery. I'm 17th generation Yoshimoto bladesmith and a master bladesmith of the American Bladesmith Society. I have the unique distinction of having lived and worked in Japan for 18 years, 6 of which was involved in an apprenticeship with a gentleman whose family represented over 400 years of bladesmithing tradition. During my 24-year career, I've hand-forged and completed over 16,000 knives, and I've hand-sharpened over 50,000 knives using the techniques that we're going to share with you here today. 8 years ago, we filmed this video, Introduction to Knife Sharpening. It's been very well received, and I'm happy to say we've had thousands of satisfied customers who have contacted us by phone, email, or snail mail, telling us the great results they've had by applying the techniques that we outlined in that video. Many customers have successfully taken kitchen knives, hobby knives, hunting knives, and sharpened them up to the point where they could literally shave their face with them. So I'm confident that with this revision that we're going to make today in this video, that you'll be able to do the same thing. In the old video, we outlined a process called the 6-step procedure of knife sharpening. I've further revised that and refined that to the 7-step procedure of knife sharpening, and that's what we're going to share with you here today. The first run we'll go through and I'll sharpen some knives from start to finish using the 7-step procedure. I'll tell you each step that I'm on, and I'll give you some minor details, but only enough so we can keep the procedure rolling so you can get a feel for the overall process. Then we'll go and we'll do it a second time, really slowly, and I'll just address every single detail that I could possibly think to mention. I teach a lot of classes and I have a fairly good knack at anticipating your questions. And so as I think of what question you might be thinking, I'll try to give you the answers. And of course, with all of our video productions and YouTube productions, if there's any questions or comments or concerns you ever have, just please feel free to email us or call us. Our email is murray@cartercutlery.com. And our phone number is 503-447-1029, but that's going to be on the packaging. So I really not only want to give you the technical expertise that allows you to simply sharpen your knives in an economical way, but I also want to inspire you and motivate you to let you know that just like the thousands of other people who have applied our techniques, you too can become a master sharpener. What's it going to take? Well, let's be realistic. If you spend 20 or 30 minutes with your sharpening system and some knives each month, that's not a big investment. By 2 or 3 years' time, you'll be well on your way to mastery. And not only that, is that once you start sharpening, you're going to start being aware of the things that you need to pay more attention to. And you're always welcome to email us or contact us with specific knife sharpening questions after you've given it a try. So, let's start the process without any further ado and give you the fast-paced information that you're looking for. Okay, 2 things let me outline before we actually get started. The first is the actual 7-step procedure. The first step is we're going to clean the knife. The second step is we're going to check the blade for straightness. Third is, and possibly most importantly, we're going to make a game plan. We're going to assess the condition of the knife and decide what needs to be done to it. Step 4 is we're going to adjust the blade thickness. Step 5 is we're going to establish a new primary edge. Step 6 is we're going to hone, or I like to refer to stropping, the primary edge. And step 7 is we're going to polish and refine that stropped edge with the fine finish stone. The next thing I want to share with you is the all-important technique. In fact, folks, this technique is more important than what you actually do with the knives on the stones. This technique is called the 3-finger test of edge sharpness. Whenever you pick up a blade, whatever kind of blade, folding knife, kitchen knife, hunting knife, whatever, You're going to always pick it up in your, what I call your dominant hand. I'm right-handed, so my right hand is my dominant hand. I'm going to call my left hand my support hand. You always pick the blade up in your dominant hand, as if you were holding it to cut something with, or holding it to sharpen with, or perhaps you're at a knife show or at a knife store and you're picking it up to just examine it. So if the blade is in your dominant hand, what you're going to do is you're going to put the thumb of your support hand on the spine of the blade. Now that's your safety mechanism. That's what allows you to do this test in complete safety and peace of mind and get the most accurate feedback. Then you're going to take your first 3 fingers and you're going to put them together, and ever so gently you're going to put them on the blade of the knife, right on what we call the primary edge. That's the part that initiates the cutting in a blade. Now, you're not going to try to stroke your fingers back and forth, but rather you're going to attempt to slide your fingers along the cutting edge of the blade. You're going to check the heel, you're going to check the belly, and you're going to check the tip of the blade. Now, if a blade is dull, as many are in your kitchen, let me get a dull blade here. Okay, if you have a dull blade, at first you're going to do the 3-finger test of edge sharpness with very, very light pressure. But if you don't sense any danger, you can push a little harder. Your brain will tell you when to stop. And for example, in this blade, it's so dull, I can make my fingers absolutely white with the pressure. Now, you know, if I pushed with all the force that I had in my body, maybe I could get this blade to cut in my fingers. Of course, you would ask, why would I want to do that? I don't. So that's why we start off with light pressure. But, you know, this knife is just as dull as can be. If a blade happens to be sharp, then as soon as you attempt to move your fingers, your brain will tell you to stop. But here's the thing. If you do this 3-finger test of edge sharpness with every single blade that ever comes into your hands, you will intuitively know what condition the blade is in, simply from experience. So don't take my word for it. I'm encouraging you all to get out your blades and start doing the 3-finger test of edge sharpness. You're going to see why throughout this video, why that is so important. So now that I've talked about the 7-step procedure and the all-important 3-finger test of edge sharpness, let's begin and show you how these principles are applied. Okay, well, let's see what we can do to my friend's kitchen knife here. Remember, step 1 is we're going to clean it. We'll put our stone back up on our little setup. I'll explain this setup after we get through this knife. And we're going to clean it with a little bit of cleanser. Doesn't matter what cleanser you use. You could use an SOS steel wool pad. You could use your powdered cleanser like I'm using. There are some cleansers that come in little canisters. What I'm being careful of here is to angle the cutting edge into the cutting board so that my finger doesn't trail over it on an exposed edge and get cut. And then do the same thing on this side. Raise that back up a little bit so the edge is tight up against the stone. Especially get in here to this blade handle junction. Now, definitely need to keep the back clean. That's going to be really important for our step 2. Clean the handle. Paying particular attention to where that cutting edge is. Okay, that will conclude cleaning the blade. If you get any stubborn rust on there or what have you, you can just try a more aggressive abrasive like the steel wool. Get it nice and dry. Now we're going to do step 2. We're going to be checking for blade straightness. The reason we do this is because we don't want to try to sharpen blades that are way bent out of shape or twisted out of shape. It'll just end up in frustration. So I check this way with the point towards me and the edge down, handle away from me. I'm checking tip towards my eyes, edge up. Now this is third way. I'm looking with it in my dominant hand. I've got the tip pointed to my opposite side, and I'm looking to see if the blade isn't twisted a little bit like an airplane propeller. Now, this way I've got the blade horizontal, tip again pointed towards my eyes, and I'm reflecting light off of this big flat surface here. And I'm just trying to see. This will just confirm whatever I saw in the first 3 steps of checking for blade straightness. and then we turn it the opposite way, and that's all 5 steps. Okay, I've determined that this blade is straight within reason, so we can proceed to step 3. Now this is probably the singular most important step in the whole 7-step procedure of sharpening. And that is because at this step, we have to formulate a game plan. What is it we're actually trying to do? Is there a tip that's broken that needs reprofiling? Is there any serious damage along the edge? Obviously, the blade is dull, so we need to establish a new primary edge, and that will come later in step 5. And the other thing is does the edge, or the secondary edge, or the overall blade thickness, does it need to be adjusted? Does it need to be thinned down? And as a beginner, your assumption in that case is always going to be yes, it needs to be thinned down. Almost all blades, especially the ones you find in North America, are overbuilt. They're a little too thick in the spine, and they're kind of built with the least common denominator in mind. You know, for the guy who's a little bit klutzy and he uses his knives always in an abusive manner. So the manufacturers build their knives to withstand that. But we want knives that cut really well, so we want them nice and thin. So we're going to need to thin down that secondary edge. Ideally, every time you sharpen a blade, you're going to remove a little bit of material from the secondary edge, which is up here, and the primary edge, which is what does the initial cutting. So, step 3, I'm assessing what I need to do. This tip's not too bad, the edge isn't too badly damaged, but yes, I'm always going to need to thin it down. So let's get into that. That brings us to step 4, which is the actual grinding, or the blade thickness adjustment. I'm going to take the rougher of my 2-stone set. Basically, if you're going to use stones to sharpen, you need one stone that's rough and you need one that's finer. We'll talk more about those details later. These happen to be a 1,000 grit and a 6,000 grit stone. But you could use a 800 and a 2,000. You could use a 1,200 and an 8,000. You could use you'll see later, we're going to use a block of concrete and a bit of cardboard. It's the principle that matters. Rough stone to grind away with and a fine stone to refine everything. So this is how we grind that secondary edge. I'm going to put the blade on the stone, and I'm going to put the fingers of my support hand right where I want to grind steel off on the other side. So I'm going to kind of mirror it. So if I put my fingers here and now move the blade back and forth 5 times, and now check it, yes, I can see I've just removed steel from up here and down there right towards the primary edge. This is a hollow ground blade. And so eventually we'll grind that flat, but for now, we've got 2 points of contact here where both of my thumbnails are. So that's the first section of this blade. We'll work and mentally divide this blade into 4 sections. Here's the second section. Good. Yeah, I can see good abrasion there. I'll move down to the 3rd section. Okay, keep your stone and your blade nice and clean and flushed off. Now I'm working on the last section, the heel. You notice I have a tendency to try to work my whole stone, not just the middle of the stone. If you do that, then eventually the middle of your stone will dish out. Okay, now compared to this first side, let me dry it off, give you a good view here. Compared to this first side, which looks just as it did before I started anything, if you look at this side, you can see these 2 train track grinding marks where I've been grinding the secondary edge. Again, because it's hollow, the very middle section has not been making contact with the stone yet. But after 4 or 5 subsequent sharpenings, those train tracks will widen and widen and widen, and eventually they'll join in the middle, and then we'll have a flat grind, which is always better when you're looking to maintain your own blades. So we've made one pass on one side, and we'll work on the other side now, doing everything in mirror. Fingers now of my dominant hand, right where I want the grinding to take place on the other side. Now the all-important technique here is to keep checking. Keep checking as you grind. Let your eyes give you the feedback that you need. Here we go, it's going as planned. Working each one of those 4 sections. Here we go. Keep everything cleaned off. Now, just for fun, I'll go ahead and do one more round on either side, a little bit more quicker. Now, some people want to know, at this stage, do you have to grind your blade back and forth in the stone? Some people like to remember that their grandfather taught them how to do circles on the stone, or figure eights. At this stage, you're just grinding metal away from the blade. It doesn't matter how you do it, as long as you do it, as long as you grind the metal from where you want to grind the metal. And when you visually inspect it, you confirm that that's exactly what you are doing, is removing metal in a predetermined way. Okay, so that's one round on either side. I've been working the secondary edge. That's what step 4 is all about, is adjusting the thickness. Now we're going to progress to step 5. That is grinding a new primary edge. Primary edge being that edge along the very outside of the blade that does the cutting. Similar to step 4, we're going to work this blade in sections, but where we put our fingers right here heavy on the blade in order to make that secondary edge contact the stone. In this case, we're going to kind of keep our fingers there, lighten up the pressure a little bit, and what we're going to do is we're going to raise the spine of that blade off the stone. Now, how much? Well, I always say just make it a really, really low angle. The more acute you can sharpen this blade at, the sharper it'll be. Yes, there is the technical possibility you might grind that edge so thin that when you use it for the first time, the edge crumples and fails. That can happen, but it almost never does in reality. It's more of a theoretical worry than it is a true real-world concern. If it happens, then you've just done a super fine job of sharpening, and I commend you for it. So we're going to raise that up a hair, and now we're going to start grinding in a new primary edge. Remember, examine. I'm looking for a new pattern of light right along here, right along the primary edge. Now, this whole concept of what angle to sharpen that primary edge at, you will learn through experience, intuitively. But just for now, keep in mind the golden rule that all blades should be as thin as possible, but yet still withstand repeated use/abuse. So after you sharpen a knife and you start using it, you'll be able to monitor that primary edge for how it's standing up, how it's holding up. And if you need to, you can just always go back to the stone, and in a matter of literally seconds, you can thicken that primary edge up a little bit by grinding away a little bit of the super thin material. You'll almost never need to do that, but it could be possible if you sharpen a knife super thin and then you wanted to, for example, cut lobster tails off with it. You know, after you've been using a blade for slicing tomatoes, for example, you might want to go back to the stone and just beef that primary edge up just a little bit. And then when you're finished cutting the lobster tails, you could go right back and thin the primary edge down again and get it ready for cutting tomatoes again. Okay, you notice how I've been breaking the blade up mentally into sections and then constantly observing my work. Now, we've done one round. The next thing is we come back to the 3-finger test of edge sharpening. Okay, I feel I may have, right there, I think I've established a new primary edge. It's not sliding anymore, it's a little grippy. Still really slippery and slick up here. And I can visually confirm it. You can always look at the edge of a blade in a good strong source of light, and anywhere where the blade's super dull, basically where the edge has been mashed down and it's formed a flat plateau, it's going to reflect light. So actually I can see light right there. Wherever you've sharpened it, you won't see light anymore. Okay, so you don't need to go and rework the sections that feel sharp to you. You just start reworking the sections that were still slippery, that would still slide on your fingers. Don't increase the angle. The temptation will be there to do that. But anytime you raise that angle up high, you've gone and undone all the hard work that you've done to establish a nice acute edge. Okay, the light seems to be gone. Yeah, there we go. Established a new primary edge. There's a little bit of portion here that's a little bit iffy, so I'm just going to do one more round lightly. There's that second section, third section, fourth section. The closer you get to where you want to be, the more you need to slow it down for precision. There we go. Okay, let's test it with a 3-finger. Yes. Okay, great. My fingers are telling me that we've established a new primary edge. I can actually, if I slide my fingers, I have to do it with the lightest pressure because the edge of the blade is actually cutting into the epidermis of my finger. I mean, but it's so minute because of the control I have, because of the thumb on the back of the blade, it could never draw blood. Okay. So next we're going to proceed to step 6. Step 6 is honing, or what I like to call stropping, that primary edge. And the way we do that is we're going to conscientiously grind it at the same angle. Okay, so we were here for the secondary edge in step 4. We came up here for the primary edge in step 5. So now whatever we do, we want to do it at that same angle. But what I'm going to do is, rather than moving away from the stone and into the stone, as in my backwards and forwards motion like I did in step 5, from here on out for step 6, all I'm going to do is do what we call a trailing or a away from the edge motion, just stropping it backwards like this. And what I like to do is I like to start with a tip on one corner of the stone and then move the blade in a nice, slow, controlled manner and end up with the heel on the other side of the stone. Now we'll do it in mirror, tip to heel, tip to heel, tip to heel. We usually do that 5 times each side. There's no golden rule there, that's just a guideline. Okay, good. That's step 6. So, oh yeah, boy, see now when I test that with my 3 fingers, that feels so aggressive. It feels like there's little shark teeth on the edge of this blade. I mean, this blade's technically ready for cutting most stuff you'd ever cut in your kitchen, but we can make it better by progressing to a finer abrasive. So I'll put my 1,000 grit stone away, get out my 6,000 grit stone. And this is step 7. Step 7 is 2-part. It's going to consist of polishing up that secondary edge. When we adjusted the thickness of the secondary edge with the rougher stone, it actually leaves scratches. Of course, you can't get rid of the metal unless you scratch it off, but it leaves scratches, and what we can do is we polish that up with our finer stone. And then what we'll do is we'll raise the spine of that blade up again, and then we will refine the primary edge. So we are following that secondary edge. Notice where my fingers are. And observing, using the whole stone. Observing. This doesn't take much once you get to this stage. Okay, we have not only thinned out that secondary edge, but we've made it pretty again. And now what we'll do is we're going to strop or hone that primary edge again by going from tip to heel. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now, at this stage, what we need to do is we need to remove the burr. There's a little bit of metal particles on the very edge of that knife that are just kind of holding on for dear life because of the temper in the blade. And they'll be in your way when you're cutting. So you need to remove those by just dropping them through, by pulling it through a piece of soft wood. And then come back here and we'll strop that edge 1 or 2 more times each side. Okay, now we have what's called a scary sharp edge. Let me get a piece of newspaper. Okay. So you can see a perfectly adequate sharpening job on what is otherwise not even a very expensive or exclusive piece of cutlery. But just by thinning down that secondary edge, establishing a new primary edge, and honing that, and then polishing all with a finer stone has given us a nice functional edge in the kitchen. Okay. Now we're going to repeat that whole process. I'm going to give you much greater detail, telling you about every single thing along the way. And then we'll look and we'll troubleshoot some other knives, and we'll talk about broken points and you know, whatever you need to know as a beginning sharpener, okay? Okay, let's first discuss our setup here. I'm set up at a kitchen sink. This is actually where I sharpen every single blade of mine that gets sent out for delivery. Sometimes this whole counter here is lined up with 20 or 30 blades, and I sharpen and cycle through each one. So this is not staged. This is actually where I do it. In fact, we're working around some handicaps as we film today. We've got a little wall here, and that's why we've got things set up the way they are. And we're working around that. It works just fine in real life. It presents some challenges when we're trying to film. But let's look here. I've got a stainless steel sink and obviously a source of water. The beautiful thing about water stones is we can use as much water as we want. It's basically free. I mean, you pay a little bit for it, but it's not like trying to flush an oil stone off with gallons and gallons of oil. Water is available everywhere and basically free. So let's look at this setup we have here. Maybe we can get close up. I'm going to dry off my stone here. The first thing that you want to do if you're going to try to emulate, copy this setup is take a measure of wood. This is about 3/4 of an inch thick. I don't think it really matters what kind the wood is. And measure the inside dimension of your sink or bucket or whatever it is that the area where you're going to sharpen. So this measure of wood fits right in between the openings of my sink. And then we have a second piece of wood that sits on top of that. And if you look carefully, these 2 pieces of wood have been joined by some heavy-duty screws. Take careful attention that the screws do not come out through the surface of the wood. So there's the screws. There's your 2 pieces of wood. That's the setup. So the beautiful thing is here is this fits right in between my sink. It's been so carefully measured that it actually takes a little bit of pressure to sit it down in there. Now, that thing's not going anywhere. It's really, really solid, nice and tight. You can put that right under here sometimes in order that you can trickle water on your stone. That's another way to do it. But I usually use mine a little offset like this right here. The next thing, once you get your wood measured and in place, then it's nice to take a cloth of some kind. This cloth is going to become trashed after a few uses, so don't use your best linen. Now the cloth is going to provide a stable base for your stone to sit on, so that as you're sharpening, the stone doesn't move backwards and forth, and it makes a nice safe situation. Today, because we're filming and we're trying to get over the height challenge here of the sill there, as I've taken one of our other sharpening stones, because of its size, this happens to be a natural water stone from Japan, and I've just put that there to give me a little bit more height, make it for a base. So I've then folded over this cloth so that I can put my other stone on it. Now, let's talk briefly about the stones. Well, Murray, you're using water stones, but could I use my oil stones? Or what about diamond stones? Or what about ceramic stones? Well, if you apply the principles and use the 7-step procedure of knife sharpening, in conjunction with always testing it with your 3 fingers, you can use anything. And we'll actually go through and we'll look at different sharpening systems a little later. What you need fundamentally is 1 rough stone and 1 fine stone. So this happens to be a 1000 grit king stone from Japan. It's a synthetic man-made stone. And the other stone that I'm using today is a synthetic man-made king 6000 grit. If you're using oil or ceramic or whatever, what you need to do primarily is make sure that the surface of the stone is well maintained and kept clean and free from metal debris and buildup. So, something else about the stones also is I used to be a stickler for always looking at my stone and seeing where the high spots on the stone are after use, and then trying to only use the high spots of the stone. Now, that's a great romantic way to make sure that you use your stone up as efficiently as possible without wasting any of the abrasive. But now I'm a little bit more mellow in how I view the maintenance of the stone, and so I'm no longer opposed to having, like a second old kind of worn out stone that every now and then you can look at and you can use to grind the surface of your stone a little bit. It does 2 things. It just kind of makes the stone a little easier to use, and I actually take pleasure in kind of sculpting and shaping the stone back to a nice flat shape again. And then additionally, it does free up if there's any place on your surface where you've somehow gotten a little bit of oil or some kind of contaminants, or the stone's kind of loaded up, this will clean the surface of the stone. I don't recommend you do this all the time, because then you're just really just wearing your stone down prematurely. But I used to say don't do it at all, and now I say, yeah, if you want to do a little bit, that's fine. It's your stone, you can maintain it as you like. And I've taken joy doing that a little bit too. So this is our setup. Make sure, see there, I got a little bit of movement. Make sure everything's firm, and you can firm that up a little bit by pushing down on it and getting rid of any excess moisture that's in that towel between your base and the stone you're going to use. And now you can see that's nice and firm. Okay, so that brings us to step 1, which was the cleaning of the knife. So we have a whole selection of knives here today, but primarily there's 2 different types of knives that we'll sharpen. One type of knife is a homogeneous steel knife, and a homogeneous steel means that it's the same, from the handle all the way to the tip, from the cutting edge all the way to the back. No matter how you cut into that blade, it's the same material. Usually those are going to be all stainless steel or carbon steel blades. The other kind of knife that I specialize in, and that I've forged 16,000 of, and that happen to be easier to sharpen and maintain, are laminated blades. And a laminated blade, such as this one right here, it's got a outer shell of one kind of steel and an inner core of another, kind of like an Oreo cookie where you got the cream on the inside and your chocolate wafers on the outside. So these are all 3-layer laminates. This one happens to be mild steel with a carbon steel edge. Other knives that I make are mild stainless steel on the outside with a high carbon steel core in the middle. So cleaning those can present some challenges. For example, if you have a mild steel carbon steel laminate, or if you have a all homogeneous carbon steel blade, well, you can see the carbon steel gets a surface patina. Now, the patina in the worst case scenario can be rust so thick that it's starting to pit the blade. And in most normal cases, it's just kind of a bluish, brownish, blackish patina, as in the case with this knife here. So when we're cleaning the blade, not only are we trying to get off any kind of like food or oil that might be on the blade and handle, but we might have some luck in getting rid of some of that patina as well. And even stainless steel blades, if they're left in water, they'll get a patina over time, and they can even rust in spots. So again, your choice of cleanser is up to you. I like Comet Cleaner simply because the economy you know, getting a bottle like this, I think I paid 97 cents for it yesterday, and that's, you know, hundreds of cleanings in that one. And you can of course use it around the kitchen and the shop for many other things as well. And I like to clean in a backwards and forwards motion, again keeping that edge tight in against the stone so I don't end up cutting the pads of my fingers off here. But I'll clean one side here and then show you the other unclean side, and we'll see if we can't see a difference. And you'll just see the immediate effect of the cleanser. There's another product that we use quite often. It's a little expensive. It's called Flitz Metal Polish, and there's I think Semi-Chrome. There's several products out there on the market, and you know, whatever one works best for you. I don't endorse any one over the other, except for the ones I use. Okay. Oh yes, that's cleaned it up really nicely. Of course, you know, be careful as you're handling that you don't cut yourself. So there's before, and here's the side we just cleaned. Okay, it's considerably cleaner. It's actually kind of attractive looking now. You can see the years of use. So we haven't hidden its history, but we've also kind of shown the world that we're loving and looking after this knife, and it's well maintained, and that speaks volumes about the knife and the user. So we'll clean up the other side now. Yep. One thing I say about even my knives, you know, I put my heart and soul into making my knives, and then I sell them, and many people are kind of astonished when they hear me say something like, I don't believe my knives are finished. They're not completed. They say, what do you mean? You're going to sell me a knife that's not completed? And I take joy telling them, I said, it's not until you use it and put your own special, you know, scratches and maintenance and, you know, grinding and sharpening marks on it. And it's not, you put the finishing touches on the blade as the owner. And that's kind of what completes the ownership. That's what completes the knife. Until then, it's just kind of like a knife waiting to be taken ownership of. This is one of those ways in which you can kind of personalize your knife, is by the way you look after it and take care of it. And remember, we definitely need to clean and polish that spine, the back of that blade. Be careful you don't come back this way, because you always run the risk of tip cutting yourself. So as you get towards that tip, you know, come off of it like that. Something else too is, as you're cleaning it, it's just a little subjective thing, but you just kind of, you're kind of handling the blade in a way that you don't usually handle it. And I wouldn't quite say it's like washing a baby, but there are similarities, there's parallels. You're kind of becoming more familiar with it. And as I'm washing this blade for the first time, it becomes apparent to me like, oh wow, look, this handle is cracking here. Maybe I ought to get the epoxy glue out next Sunday and maybe fill in these cracks here to prevent it from getting worse. Or maybe I could say, hey, this rivet's starting to push out. Maybe there's something I could do about that. In other words, other things that are important to the maintenance of this knife come to my attention through the process of washing it. That's why it's an important step that shouldn't be omitted. Ultimately, if you're the one using these knives that you're sharpening, the effectiveness of this knife comes through the fact that you become intimately familiar with the blade, and it becomes a natural extension of your hand, so that you can start cutting things with it without looking at it. If you're a hunter and you've got your hands deep into the carcass of an elk or a deer, you got a knife in one hand and you're trying to find the windpipe or something in the other, and you're needing to cut, you know, if the knife feels like a foreign object in your hand, the risk of cutting yourself and injury is great. But if it's your like little neck knife or whatever that you use every day, that becomes a natural extension of your hand, and you can use it effectively and safely. And so this little love and care we're giving our knife is all part of becoming familiar with her knife. Okay, I think we really hit all the main points for cleaning the knife. That brings us to step 2, which is checking for straightness. So let me say that there's no such thing as a perfectly straight knife. When I think of straight, I think of a laser beam. And when I make my knives, that's the ideal I'm aiming for. And as a matter of fact, when I make my knives, I sit down at my straightening station, which is a round stump with a brass hammer, and I actually straighten my knives about 7 or 8 times between the time I start forging the blade to the time it gets delivered to a customer. So I don't just like straighten it once. It gets straightened over and over and over again. Especially as I grind metal away from one side of my blade and then grind it away from the other. Sometimes the stresses within the steel work different ways, and you can start off with a straight blade before you start grinding that secondary edge in, only to find out later that it's twisted a little bit now as you relieve some stress from one side. So straightening is something that's really important at Carter Cutlery, and it's important for you too with your knives. But we are looking for just straight within reason. If it's not straight, let's say for example I had a real serious hump right in the middle of my blade, that part might not come in contact with the sharpening stone as you're sharpening it, and that might be a case of a lot of frustration. So here's what you can do with blades that are noticeably, I'm going to get you a blade that's noticeably bent. I'm pointing this blade towards you at the camera, and if this blade was straight, that tip of the knife should be about there. Hopefully it's clear to you that this blade is sorely curved over towards my right-hand side. Sorely curved over there. If it's like this, and this is a homogeneous blade, I mean it's all the same steel, you can try to bend it back, being careful of the tip and the edge. You can kind of use your thumbs as a vise. I'm pulling on my hand, pulling with my fingers, and pushing with my 2 thumbs, and you can push that where you need to and check it again, and push it where you need to and check it again. Now there's always a risk that you might bend that too heavily and break the blade. But if it is as bent as this one is, you really have nothing to lose. Now if it was great grandpa's knife and it's an heirloom and no one really uses it anyway, and someone just asks you to sharpen up and clean it up so they can put it away for safekeeping, don't mess with it. But if it's a knife you want to use in your kitchen and you really want to get it straight, then you can tweak it. You can try put it on the counter and put it where that bend is, and either lift up on the handle or put it the opposite way and push down on the handle. Now this is kind of an advanced technique, but I have here what's called my straightening block. You could use something like oak or hickory, a strong wood. This happens to be an extra large chunk of micarta, which is an industrial material, which is basically consists of plastic and fiber. And you would put your blade in right where the worst part is, and you kind of tweak it like this a little bit at a time, continually checking to see if you're making any progress. And you might want to wear safety. If you're really pushing really hard on a homogeneous blade, you might want to put on a pair of safety glasses or look away as you're, yeah. Okay, so now, in the spirit of things, when I'm teaching my classes, I'm always telling my students, don't try to make everything absolutely perfect, just try to make it better. Hopefully, at the end of the project, if every step along the way you've tried to make things better, the result will be something that's nearing perfection. But we don't want to be overly obsessed with perfection at every step, because sometimes things just don't get finished when you become a perfectionist. So this is not perfectly straight yet, but I've definitely made it better. I'll give it one more attempt. Well, that's much better. Much better. I've really straightened out the blade. Yeah, it's about 70 or 80% better. So we can just leave that for now, because I've made it better. So we were going through all the different steps for checking to see if a blade is straight. And we were looking at it with the spine of the blade up, with the tip towards you, and then the edge up, tip towards you. And the reason why we're doing it to tip towards me is because if you look at a blade like this, like you commonly see people do, the fundamental problem here is that what my eye can see from here is from the end of the handle to this point right here. You know what that means? That means that the rest of the blade was out of my view. And that's why we always do it point towards us. And then with the edge up. Then we look at it with the blade horizontal and with the edge towards our eyes, and you can close one eye or leave both eyes open, you can see it pretty much the same way. What we're looking for here is to see if the blade's twisted like a propeller or not. Now, unfortunately, a twist in the blade isn't easily remedied in your home kitchen. You can fix a bent blade fairly easily, but a twisted blade requires advanced techniques to fix. If it's just mildly twisted, you can go with it and just sharpen it and use it. However, if it's severely twisted, then you better send it off to your favorite knife smith and see if they can do anything with it. After we've checked it for twistedness, the next thing we do is we hold it, again, tipped towards us. We're reflecting light off the surface. Now, we're not going to see anything new here that we didn't see in the first 3 steps. However, it will confirm everything that we thought we saw. We'll see the little idiosyncrasies in the surface of the blade as it reflects light. So this is one of those things where you've got to do it. You just can't learn about this on a videotape. So get out there and get your knives and look at them this way, this way, this way, this way, and that way. And once you've done that with 20 different knives, you're going to start to see some patterns, and your eyes are going to start, you're going to exercise those little muscles in your eyes that are going to pick up on what a bent blade looks like, what a twisted blade looks like, or even a compound bent blade where it's kind of bent in one place and then bent the opposite way somewhere else, and maybe having a little twist in it as well. So you got to gain that by experience. The 3-finger test of edge sharpness and checking for blades straightness are skills gained with experience. But anyone who I've ever taught them to, who's done it 30 or 40 times, has all of them have picked up on all the little fine points that you need to. So you can do it too. Now that we've checked it for straight, and this knife in particular, the only thing that I see that I could improve on is that while the blade is, I'm going to say very close to being straight, to the point where I don't need to fuss with it, there is a distinct bend between where the handle is and the blade. So I actually want to bend it right where that blade handle junction is. And this, again, being carbon steel, this fella probably isn't going to take a correction. It took a little bit of a correction. Let's get, okay, that's as much as I dare do with this one. It's better, and that's what we can live with. Okay. So that's step 2, straightening the blade. Now, step 3. Step 3 is assessing what needs to be done to the blade. As I've already mentioned, almost all blades that you're going to run across in North America can use a good thinning out in cross-section. That's going to involve grinding away some of the secondary edge. So another big consideration in step 3 is what is happening or what has happened to the point of your knife. Points are really important in knives, whether they be kitchen knives, outdoor knives, folding knives, what have you. Points are there for a reason, and that is there's often material that you need to puncture. Let's say in the case of a kitchen knife, let's say you go and you buy yourself a nice steak. It's wrapped in that cellophane wrap with a little styrofoam bottom plate. Well, it's nice to have a point. Cut that out real nicely. Another thing that you might use the point for in any knife would be cutting out a newspaper article, cutting out something from a magazine. Really important to use that point. Obviously, something like a dagger, obviously you need a point on. Hopefully no one needs a dagger, but you might, who knows, you might need to fight a bear off that's jumped on top of you. You might need a point. The other thing that you would use a point for is if you were a hunter, is making that initial incision, to open up the hide of an animal in order to field dress it. So points are really important, but they often get neglected. This one here is a little bit round, and some people abuse the points on knives. Of course, it's the weakest point on the knife. There's less metal in cross-section here, both in thickness and in width, because of the very nature of the way it's designed. So you run into knives that actually get their tips broken off, their points broken off. And so a lot of knives need refurbishing on the points. I'm going to go get a knife that I know has got some serious point issues. This one here has been broke off. And right where it's broken, I can see where the metal is kind of, was bent. It bent so far and then broke off, but part of it stayed bent, which is an indication of a good tempering, by the way. Okay, so again, does the point need refurbishing? Is there any damage on the cutting edge or the primary edge of the blade? Are there any chips? Some blades that are ground really thin, like the Japanese blades, with a combination of the thin ground blade and the higher Rockwell hardness, which means that the hardness of the steel is harder, those blades, when they're pushed past a certain point, they can chip out these little half-moon chips. Got a great excerpt that we'll share with you later called Why Blades Chip. And so if you have any chips on the edge, you know, that's something else. So you say, this is step 3, I need to fix the chips on the edge. Now, if they're minor chips, you can just be assured that with repeated sharpenings, you'll eventually get the chips out. So you might not feel like you need to get the chips out just in one session of sharpening. You might think, well, by the time I've sharpened this blade the 3rd time, they'll be gone. In the case of really severe chips, where it's actually going to impede, for example, long slicing cuts, because things get caught up in that area where there's no cutting edge, you might need to, you know, spend 2 or 3 hours over the course of however long you want to divide that up into to fully get that chip out. Another consideration is serrated blades. Now, especially with the less expensive knives that you might find at the supermarket, that seem to be plentiful in a lot of people's kitchen, they have certain serration patterns. You see two different patterns here of serrations. Serrations in general are put in knives of lesser quality steel to enhance their cutting performance. By putting serrations in a blade, it effectively elongates the cutting surface. If this was a 7-inch blade here, you effectively get 8 inches worth of cutting edge by making the cutting edge wavy. The other thing too is that the tips of a serration will contact hard surfaces first, and they'll get dull and they'll kind of protect the inner scalloped cutting edges of serrations. Well, in theory, it all sounds kind of cool, but they don't cut very well. But worst thing about serrations is they totally go against the criteria for high performance cutlery. Now, people think, well, what's a high performance piece of cutlery? They think, oh, it's one that has a super razor sharp edge that holds it for a long time. But as a matter of fact, those are actually low on the list of high performance criteria. The very top criteria for high performance cutlery is its maintainability. In other words, its sharpenability. How easy is it to whip that primary cutting edge and the secondary edge back into the best condition possible? Well, serrations are almost impossible for most people to sharpen, and they inhibit regular maintenance with stones. So we're going to treat most serrated blades as if they've got lots of little chips in them, and my advice to you is sharpen them right out. Well, hang on a minute, Murray. What about my steak knives and my bread knives? Okay, well, I'm glad you brought that up. Steak knives, you know, if you're determined to eat your steak on ceramic plates, clearly ceramic is many times harder than the steel in a knife. And so it doesn't matter your top quality $700 Carter laminated kitchen knife isn't going to hold up against being cut on a ceramic plate. Doesn't matter that I use a white steel core #1 in there with 1.4% carbon and 64 Rockwell. Ceramic is way harder than that, and this edge on this knife will be trashed the first time it even comes in contact with ceramic. So in that case, a soft stainless steel knife with serrations is good for cutting steak. Not only will the little scallops behind the serrations, the points, serration points, be protected, but as those points hit the hard ceramic plate, one will mash this way and one will mash that way, and they kind of get mashed all over, kind of like the teeth of a crosscut saw, and it'll actually enhance the ripping action of the knife through the steak. Now, it's not going to give you a nice cut, but it'll do a good job of getting the steak into small pieces. So yeah, if you got steak knives, leave the serrations in. But, you know, just leave them for the steak. The other thing is bread. The one area that even the very finest of kitchen cutlery will get stumped on, even with an edge that's scary sharp, shaves hair, slices newspaper, and it's got these little micro teeth that we call scary sharp, it still won't cut bread that's fresh out of the oven. You really need a task-specific knife. If you want to cut your bread straight out of the oven, then you need a serrated knife. You know, like, it doesn't matter. And you want a long knife. Even longer than this would be better for bread. And a nice stiff-bladed knife. This one's on the thin side. This knife would be better off having the serrations sharpened out of it and used for other purposes. But a blade like this with a thicker spine, with maybe another 2 inches of length, 3 inches of length, would make a good bread knife. Leave the serrations in. But here's the thing. After bread is being pulled out of the oven and it sits on the counter for an hour or two, the hard crust actually becomes soft and moist. You probably noticed that, kind of like the moisture in the inside of the bread it kind of spreads to the outside, and plus the humidity in the air softens the crust. Well, once bread gets to that point where the crust is no longer hard, a smooth, straight edge that's freshly sharpened will cut bread so cleanly it won't make a single crumb, and the surface of your cut bread will actually reflect light. Now that's sharp. That's the kind of edge you want for cutting bread after the bread's crust isn't hard anymore. Now, some of that French bread, those baguettes and things like that, the crust just, it can stay hard for days, and especially once it gets stale, it's hard. So you might need a serrated blade. So there is a legitimate place for serrations in the kitchen, but way less than you would think. Almost all of your serrated blades, except for a bread knife and steak knives, could be sharpened to where they're a nice, smooth cutting edge. That will make it easy for you to maintain. As they get dull, you can whip them back up into shape in no time at all. So now we've talked about step 3, which was the most important step, which was assessing what actually needs to be done to your knife. It's a really important step that everyone wants to bypass. But if you bypass step 3, it's like being thrust into a tremendously large gymnasium with all the lights turned off. It's pitch black, and someone tells you there's something on the gym floor, there's a needle on the gym floor, go and pick it up. Well, can you imagine? You're in there stumbling around, hitting obstacles, bumping into things, having no idea where you're going. That's what sharpening's like if you don't take time to establish what you're going to do in step 3. Establishing what you're going to do in step 3 is like someone turning on the lights in the gym, and suddenly, boom, you can go exactly where you need to go to and get it done in the shortest amount of time because you can see. That brings us to step 4. We're going to adjust blade thickness. Now, as I mentioned so many times, but I can't emphasize enough, is that all blades could use a good thinning down. Now, clearly, you need to keep your cutting task in mind. You've got some blades that are very, very thin in cross-section, and others that are very thick in cross-section. Clearly, these blades were designed for different tasks. If you're going to be chopping through bones, for example, cutting the heads off of fish and so on, that's what this blade was designed for. And so it's very thick in cross-section, and it has a fairly obtuse edge. And by obtuse, I mean that the edge looks closer to this than it does to this, which might be something more ideal at slicing or doing a julienne of a green pepper, for example. So the best way to determine if an edge needs thinning down and if the blade is too thick is by actually cutting through the thing that you're trying to cut through. If you're cutting through apples, cut through an apple and see, does the blade have this tendency to stick in the cut, or does it cut through all the way to the bottom in a seemingly effortless motion? The other thing you can do is apply a learned skill. That's a trick that the machinists use, is they put their thumb and their middle finger on the spine or the back of the blade, and ever so slowly and gently they draw their fingers down until they pop off that primary edge of the knife. And they do that in several places. As they're doing this, with experience, it's almost like an MRI scan. In their head, they can picture exactly the geometry of this blade. And then as they go ahead and sharpen it, they can see how they're removing some metal from the critical areas that were too thick previously. There are a lot of knives, like a lot of the German style 7 and 8 inch chef's knives that are very thick on the back of the spine of the blade. And as you draw your fingers down that secondary edge, you can feel it's getting thinner, but then suddenly they abruptly fall off onto the primary edge, which means that the steel right behind the primary edge, right where the secondary edge starts, is way too thick. So that's an acquired skill. Just like the 3-finger test of edge sharpness is an acquired skill. Just like checking blades for straightness is an acquired skill, so is this machinist trick to check for blade thickness is an acquired skill. So I encourage you to start practicing all of those, because in no time at all, you'll become the master. So I've determined I'm just going to go through and actually do some thickness reduction in 5 or 6 of the different blades I have here, and we'll talk about the particular features of each one. Well, for one, this is kind of a carving knife. It's like an 8-inch carving knife. You could carve turkey and things like that with this. And one area that presents a kind of a challenge is this radius or curve in the tip here. So actually, for most knives with kind of straight edges, if I'm mentally dividing that blade up into 3 or 4 or even sometimes 5 sections, when you have a radius like this, you also start to subdivide that up into 4 or 5 sections as well. So again, flat on that secondary edge, moving back and forth. I can see metals being removed. I'm going to look. Yes, indeed, I've removed some material where I wanted to, right on that secondary edge. Now, kind of in the middle of that curve. This is that 1000 grit stone that I do all of my rough grinding on. There we go. And then on the bottom part, well, I was able to divide that curve up into 3 sections. Of course, subconsciously, I'm putting a little bit of rock as I'm sharpening. Having done that 50,000 times, there's some things I just do naturally that kind of come subconsciously. There's right at the very tip. Middle. Okay, now I'm going to progress further down along the blade. Now, on some blades, you might want to remove more material down right towards the primary edge, just behind the primary edge. And on some knives, you might want to increase this line that's between my 2 fingers. You might want to raise it up higher, thereby giving the whole blade a thinner and a more acute profile. Again, that comes with experience, but remember, always the thinner, the better, but to the point where it has to withstand repeated use and abuse. Okay, I'm going to do the other side. Now, let me talk to you a little bit about what I'm doing here. What I've just done is I'm practicing an ambidextrous technique here, where everything I just did with my dominant hand and support hand, I've reversed, and now I'm doing it opposite. Truth be told, I don't practice this method very often, and there's a reason for that. That's because when I'm sharpening brand new knives that need to be delivered to a customer, I need to keep this hand dry, and this hand can be wet, so I can be flushing my stone and cleaning my blade off. But with a lot of the wood handles that I use for my Japanese stainless Fukugozai series knives, I need to keep my hand dry. If I didn't need to keep my hand dry, I would always prefer this ambidextrous technique, because for one thing, it's fun to learn how to use your left hand or your support hand effectively, kind of like learning new tricks. Second, it's really good and healthy for the stone. Third, you're able to get a mirror scratch pattern in both sides of your blade. That's why I like the ambidextrous technique, but I don't get to practice it enough, so I might even look a little bit awkward doing it. But if you can get both of your hands wet, then I suggest you practice this. I usually will sharpen using the first technique I showed you, and then I've got to flip the blade over, because I can't let that hand get wet normally when I'm sharpening knives for delivery. And then I have to work this way. But you're going to see a limitation of this technique here in a second. See how my blade is kind of roughly at a 45-degree angle to my stone? But guess what happens when I get close to the heel of the blade? When I'm grinding here, I'm not able to sharpen this last corner unless I rock that blade 90 degrees. And that causes some problems because now I'm going to have scratches in this blade that go this way, this way, this way, but towards here they're going to start getting all cloudy and wavy because I'm grinding at different angles. Now, is that going to be a big problem for most people? Generally not. However, visually it'll impair your blade just a little bit, especially when you get to the 7th stage where you're using that 6,000 grit stone to polish up or polish out all of those scratches that you put in with your rougher stone. So again, you've got two choices. You've got dominant hand followed by the ambidextrous method, in which I recommend you go really slowly at it first, but you know, after 10 hours on the stones of doing this ambidextrous, you'll be surprised at how fast your body learns that technique. Okay, or you can do it the one side followed by the other side. Remember to always check to see where you're grinding metal. Okay, so we've definitely made this blade better. We've thinned it down because it has a slight hollow grind on it. Parts of the middle of that secondary edge have not made contact with the stone yet, but in subsequent sharpenings they will. And in fact, up here towards the tip, we've actually ground one section completely flat. Okay, that's complete step 4 for that knife. Now what about a knife? This was the one that was bent earlier. What about a knife that has a clear primary edge? But what about the secondary edge? This has a constant grind all the way from the primary edge all the way up to the spine of the blade. Well, that is your secondary edge. So this blade doesn't have the distinction as some other knives like this, is where you've got your original blade thickness, then the secondary edge, then the primary edge. These blades have just a primary edge and a secondary edge. Now what about a sushi knife? Well, this is great. This fits in perfect timing-wise. Now you can see why I don't want to get my right hand wet, because some of these light-colored Japanese wooden handles will actually, they'll get dirty and stained, and especially if I get some of that sharpening slurry on the handle, it'll stain the handle. So that's why with these knives I always need to keep that right hand dry. But what about these knives? These knives have the original blade thickness. Then they have a bevel that starts here that usually goes all the way down to the final cutting edge. Well, if that's the case, this is the original blade thickness, and the secondary edge is the primary edge, because it goes all the way down to a cutting surface. So that's just illuminates some of the confusion about where a secondary, primary, and the blade thickness edges start and stop. So with this kitchen knife, as I was saying, primary edge, secondary edge. So when we thin out this secondary edge, the whole blade is going to be flat on the stone. I'm basically grinding that whole V section. That's a lot of steel that you're trying to abrade at the same time. And as with this knife, as with a lot of them, you can see I'm abrading here and here. There's a little spot here that's not been abraded yet, here. And that's because this blade is wavy. And you'll actually make some vast improvements on the grinding of the blade by doing this kind of sharpening. Remember to check. Work your different sections. You can use 2 fingers. You can use 3 fingers. What you got to be careful of is, if I'm using my 3 fingers as I am right now, look where my ring finger is in relationship to the tip of the knife. You'll see it's actually kind of overlapping the edge of the blade. And if you sharpen for long enough, the parts of your finger that come in contact with that stone going backwards and forwards will actually abrade away your fingerprints to the point where you actually might you might grind so much skin off that you start bleeding. That's a good sign. When you're a beginning sharpening student and you grind the finger off you grind the skin off your fingers a couple of times, you're well on your way to mastery, and eventually you'll learn to avoid that. So we could continue grinding that secondary edge. Again, trying both the ambidextrous technique. And don't forget, as a beginner, you need to stop and check what you're grinding more often, and you need to adjust as necessary. Okay, well, for that knife, boy, you can really see the high spots and the low spots on this knife. And we haven't even really gotten into here. I have to change that angle so I can get right in against that bolster on both sides. There we go. Okay, I have to ask myself a question. Did I make it better? Yes. Is it perfect? No. But we'll keep sharpening that knife over the next few months and we'll get it perfect. Will it cut better than it did before today? It sure will after I get a nice razor sharp primary edge on it. So we'll put that one away. Now, how about this Japanese cleaver style knife, this Deba? Wow, I noticed it's got some chips in the edge, but we'll get to those when we get to step 5, which is grinding in a new primary edge. Let's just make this thing a little thinner on the secondary edge. By the way, as you're grinding the secondary edge in step 4, you're actually going to intuitively learn to make lots of observations about the blade. First and foremost is you're going to feel how it either slides smoothly over the stone or how it digs right in and grips into it almost like it's cutting into a piece of soft chewed bubble gum. The softer the steel is, the more that sharpening stone will cut and grip into the stone. It'll feel like there's a lot more friction. It'll feel like it's really gummy on the stone. The harder the steel, the more it'll slide back and forth almost like a piece of glass on the stone. And you can learn about the relative hardness in the steel by sharpening different knives on the same stone all the time. Okay, let's see. A little bit more up here. Okay, good. We've made that one better. Put it aside. Now, how about this knife, this nice custom-made folding knife? It's a little liner lock, one-hand opening. It's got a very prominent hollow grind in the blade. It's wider up here than it is down here. And it looks to be made out of carbon steel. What about this knife? Do you put that flat on the stone and grind the secondary edge and thereby put scratches up here and down here? Won't that ruin the finish of the knife? Well, a lot of people think so. The unfortunate thing is that if this knife isn't cutting perfectly the way you've got it, the only way to improve its performance is to grind the blade thinner and to grind a new primary edge on it, to get it razor sharp and to get it so it'll cut through things well. So unfortunately, it's a little stigma that you're going to have to overcome by putting scratches on the blade. Now here's the good news. If you can scratch a blade in a controlled way, i.e. grind that secondary edge to get it thinner, once you learn to do that in a controlled manner, you can also polish it, which we're going to do in step 7. And you'll actually, in my opinion, make the blade look way prettier. Remember what I talked about when we cleaned up this knife here with the Comet Cleanser? And I said that, you know, when you do these things, when you show the tender loving care that you put into a knife, you finish the knife, you complete it, and you show the world that this knife is valuable to you and that you use it and that you maintain it. Well, that's to me what a really nice, even a custom knife looks like, even if it's got sharpening evidence on it or sharpening scratches or sharpening polish on it. It's a really pretty thing when it's done in the correct way. And so that's why I encourage you, even your nice custom blades, if it's not a collector's piece, if it's not a safe queen, if you really, honest to goodness, use it. Now some of you say you use it, but it doesn't really get used. If you honest to goodness use your knives, you really ought to put them flat on the stone and get them thin so that they cut real well for you. Let's see here. We do have this common buck knife, again with a really prominent hollow grind on it. Make sure if you're gonna sharpen a folding knife, It's real helpful if it has a folding mechanism on it. I've even had some liner locks when I've been sharpening them and pop, the thing kind of tried to close on me as I was sharpening it. It can get a little dangerous. So keep your eye on that as you're applying pressure. I turn my stone around there once as I'm sharpening so I don't end up favoring one side of the stone over the other. Okay, here we go. Let's lay that down on that secondary edge, and I'm going to do the hold it in your dominant hand and just flip it over technique, okay? Here we go. Right in there against the, what we call the ricasso of the blade, or right there near the end of the heel of the blade. Go back and forth. Now remember what I said earlier. At this stage, it wouldn't matter if you followed your grandpa's advice and did circles or eighths or whatever it is that you do. This is simply a mechanical function of removing metal. However, when you get close to the polishing stage, if you do circles or figure eights, what's going to happen is you're going to have striations of scratches going every which way on that blade, which makes it harder to polish. If, however, if this forwards and backwards motion is the way you grind the metal off, and then you follow that by a forwards and backwards motion with the polishing stone, you're going to get a nice, mirror quality polish on it without any kind of like strange scratches going through it, right angles to the norm there. So there's secondary edge on one side. It's difficult to pick up, but I've ground a whole bunch in here and a little bit up here. Again, it would take probably 10, with this kind of a dramatic hollow grind in the blade, it'll probably take 10 repeated sharpenings before that'll kind of close in and become a flat surface. But I still can see the original primary edge. I'm only doing this secondary edge at this stage. These buck knives really benefit from this kind of a thinning. Now you need to stop and observe a little more often than I am. You also need to go a little more slowly. When you're just learning, you're practicing, nothing wrong with going this speed. That's way better than doing it wrong. The other thing you gotta be careful of is don't come off the stone, because you'll do some damage to the blade. Another thing is don't do this. I see, it's kind of a habit with some people, but when they do that, look what happens in slow motion. The blade, I'll do it in the opposite way here too. So the blade rocks up, and as it's rocking up, okay, it's hitting that primary edge. When you get to step 5, when you get to grinding a new primary edge in, that's really detrimental. So once you stop grinding on the stone, just kind of stop and then lift it off before you reposition your hand or move around. Okay, well we've just improved the secondary edge on 2 or 3 different blades here. Let's progress on to step 5. So we've just completed the first 4 steps of knife sharpening out of the 7. And we actually haven't really made the blade any sharper. In fact, this knife is still dull to the touch, as are the others that I've ground on. We have improved them a lot though, especially this knife, even though it's still dull, it would still cut through things better than it did dull and fatter as it was before. So we'll put this one aside, and now we're going to progress on to step number 5. Step number 5 is a really important step, because now we're actually affecting the part of the knife that initiates the cut, the primary edge. Now, this is where I get to talk to you a little bit about jigs and devices. Here is a plethora of things that you may see in the marketplace for sharpening. You might see some kind of a little device like this, designed for just, pulling the edge through. This kind of a sharpening system doesn't take into account at all that you need to grind the secondary edges. It only addresses the primary edge. Here's another little gadget that essentially is the same. It's got little carbide tips on one end and ceramic rods in the other. I'll talk about the problems with ceramic here in a second. You've got, this is a mock-up. It's not the real thing. This is just a wooden base with some bamboo dowels. But there are some sharpeners on the market where you're supposed to take your blade and you're supposed to do, X number of strokes down these, and the idea is these rods are at a predetermined angle to reestablish your primary edge. Usually they're made of ceramic. Again, we'll talk about the limitations of ceramic here in a second. You have these kind of setups. That require a PhD in their use. There we go. You got these kind of setups that these come with a metal bar here that goes in there, and you clamp your blade in here, and then you grind your primary edge with these. This is a diamond stone and followed up by Arkansas stones and ceramics. Now all of these sharpening jigs and devices that I just showed you don't take into account the importance of the secondary edge. All of them only address the primary edge only. It's a faulty way of thinking, because if your blade is essentially V-shaped and you're only ever grinding metal away from the thin primary edge, then after repeated sharpenings, you work your way back up into thicker metal. You have to constantly be removing metal from the secondary edge and the primary edge to maintain the same edge geometry as the blade gets narrower through years and years of use. Here's a great example here. Okay, this is a blade that I made, a commemorative blade that I made when my son was born 13 years ago. And this blade started out just a little bit shy of this in terms of size. And we have been sharpening and resharpening. I've been using it for a lot of sharpening demos, so it's been worn down a little faster than it would normally. But this is still a functional knife with a functional edge geometry, because every time we sharpen it, we remove a little bit from the secondary edge and then refurbish that primary edge. And that's the way you want to do it. You don't want an edge that's so obtuse that you could, put it on a car axle and hammer through it with a hammer and still not have the edge damage. I mean, that's not the kind of edge geometry we want in the kitchen or in the field even. So now let me talk about angles. You see, this device assumes it knows what you need in terms of a primary angle. These devices assume that they know what's good for you in terms of a primary angle. This system assumes it knows what you need in terms of a primary angle. But you know what? It's a faulty way of thinking. Determining your primary angle has to be done on experience and not by some kind of a formula. Some people say, oh, well, we need a 22-degree included angle on our primary edge, or 15 degrees, or 30. Or for razors you need this, or for kitchen knives you need that. That whole method of thinking doesn't take into account the relative metallurgy of the blade. Understand that a blade of finer quality steel can be sharpened down to a lower or a more acute angle than a blade of lesser quality steel and still withstand repeated use/abuse. It doesn't take into account exactly what the blade is going to be used for. People say, well, kitchen knives need to be so many degrees. Well, a kitchen knife used for cutting acorn squash is a lot different than a kitchen knife used for slicing, sashimi, raw fish, or making a beautiful artistic tomato slice. You need different edge geometries for that. And lastly, it doesn't take into account the relative skill of the knife user. Some people who are very careful, picture a sushi chef. They're careful with their knives. They take every day before they start work, they take 15, 20 minutes and they get their knives into razor sharp condition. Well, do you see them slamming their knives around, letting it hit into the other cutlery and other tableware and plates and pots and things like that around the kitchen sink? No. When they finish using their knife, they wipe it off carefully. They set it down carefully in a place where nothing else is going to contact the edge. They can live and use an edge that's way finer than somebody who's, the bull in the china shop kind of person. So this whole idea about what primary edges can be, there's no substitute for experience. Again, the faulty thinking of angles. Well, if you tell me that I need a 15-degree angle, how could I maintain that by freehand on the stones anyway? You can't. Well, you say, well, maybe you could use a jig or a device or one of those roller devices that you clamp the blade in. You clamp the blade in and you just roll it over the top of your stone, for example. Yeah, that'll give you a set angle, but here's a problem with all jigs and devices, by my way of thinking. Anytime you go to sharpen with a jig or device, already in your mind, you have delegated the responsibility of getting that blade sharp to the jigger device. You don't take responsibility for it yourself. And what's worse is that when you use whatever the device is, something like this, or one of these devices that have the ceramic rods already in there, you go through the motions to get the blade sharp, and you may or may not get it sharper, that primary edge. But one thing's for sure, you won't be any smarter for having done it. You won't have gained anything in the terms of experience. When you sharpen freehand, every single stroke you take, every effort you make is yours to keep. You gain knowledge, you gain experience, you gain muscle memory. The very act of doing it opens up more questions. You know what to ask, you know what to look for. This is the way you master a skill, is doing it freehand. And you can do it, because everyone who's been watching my videos up till now has had great results. So you can too. Take your jigs and devices, throw them up on eBay and get rid of them. Get some money, get yourself a good set of stones. That's my, I'm not just trying to be a wise guy here. That's really my advice. You need to learn how to do this freehand so that you can master these techniques. Angles, when you sharpen the same knife on the same stone 5 or 6 times, and then you actually use that blade in the field, in the kitchen, wherever you use knives at your place of work, you will learn intuitively what kind of, how much you need to raise the back of that blade off that stone to create a new primary edge for your cutting task. After you've spent the 5 or 10 minutes sharpening your knife, when you're using it, take a second to look at that primary edge. See, is it holding up to repeated use? If you start to see little dimples, little waves in the edge, or heaven forbid, any little chips in the edge, you back off, say, oh, I finally crossed that threshold where I've actually gone too thin. I challenge you to do that. Go too thin. Almost nobody ever does. But if you do, then you get out your stones, you come back, and literally in 30 seconds, you just raise that angle just a little bit higher, and you stroke that blade against that stone 3 or 4 times. You grind off just a super thin steel at the very, very edge, and now you've got an edge that's robust enough for whatever you're doing. It's so easy to adjust. So easy. So that being said, now that we've addressed this whole misconception of angles, it's got to be learned by experience. Let's actually put some primary edges on some of these knives. Okay guys, we've been at this for quite some time. A lot of information for you guys to assimilate. I'm sure your head is just swarming with lots of new techniques and ideas. So what I recommend now, we're about halfway through the video, I just recommend that you go take a break. Just do something relaxing and just refresh your mind for an instant. In fact, you know what you could do? You could go to your desk, sit down at your computer, answer some emails, and then go to cartercutlery.com. Check us out there. So go ahead and take a break. Hey, what are you still here for? Go take a break. Come on. You deserve it. Okay, let's actually get to grinding that new primary edge in according to step 5. Let me get my stone out of water. I love the water stones because you can use as much water as you want. Diamond stones, while they're certainly harder than steel and they'll grind metal away, sometimes they're too hard. They leave too deep scratches in your steel. And the diamonds, they fracture over time and they become rounded out. And usually those diamonds are only ever 1 layer deep. Beautiful thing about a natural stone or a synthetic stone is that this, hundreds of thousands of granules of basically sand in there, abrasives, and as you use them, they fracture a little bit, but then they break off, exposing new ones underneath, so they always cut aggressively and quickly. That tends to be the problem with ceramic stones, is they tend to load up and they don't break off the top surface layer. We'll demonstrate that a little later on with a ceramic rod I have. And oil stones work just like a water stone would work. However, you would need to use literally buckets of oil to keep that flushed off. Normally, what does everyone do? They drop 1 little drop of oil on their stone, thinking that that's going to wash away the metal filings and the broken stone filings, but it doesn't. You need to use a lot more, and then it becomes messy. Water's nice. You don't need to change your clothes before you go sharpen your knives. You can just go and do it. All you need is a towel and a source of water. So let's see here. Let's grind a new primary edge on this little kitchen knife, this little petty knife. Now, not only, this is where I'm going to use my 3-finger test of edge sharpness extensively. You know, not only does it feel dull, but I'm going to verify it in the light. I can see light reflecting off of this edge. When it's sharpened up to a triangular cross section, there won't be any light reflecting off the edge. Okay, so what angle? Experience tells me with a kitchen knife like this, I'm going to raise it up just a little bit. Grind a new primary edge in that first section. Do a little bit of overlapping there. Section 3. Come into section 4. Again, you want to keep it, you want to go slow like this because you're just learning. Speed comes with practice. Last thing you want to do is take a big chunk out of your finger with a freshly sharpened blade. In my efforts to get as much information on this video for you guys as possible, I have to accelerate some of these processes. Now I'm going to stick with my right hand only technique instead of the ambidextrous technique. I suggest you practice both. Remember, you want to observe more than I am. So I've done one round both sides. Feel that edge according to the 3-finger test. On some parts, I can feel it's starting to grab. Other parts are still sticky, still slippery. So I'll go and do one more round. Again, resist the temptation to increase that angle. Sure, if you increase that angle by raising the spine higher, you will establish a primary edge sooner. But the kind of edge isn't the kind of edge you want. So really, you're working against yourself. Try to have the discipline to keep working at it. Some knives are in such bad condition and the steel is so hard in them that it'll take 30 or 40 minutes of just grinding that primary edge before you establish a new one. But the good news is you'll know when you're there, when your 3 fingers tell you that you have a grabby edge that's ready for cutting. A lot of guys, they go through these motions and they do everything right, nice and slow, and then they give up in frustration because the edge isn't sharp. They try to cut something with a piece of paper, and they didn't even know that they were like 95% of the way there. If they had just had the persistence to keep at it, they would have gotten that new primary edge. And if someone had taught them how to look at the edge, if someone had taught them how to check the edge with their 3 fingers, then they would have known exactly at what point in the process they were at, and they would have persevered until they got that edge. Okay, checking again. Okay, there's a sticky primary edge. It's still a little bumpy because there was some edge damage in here. We'll leave some of it in there, but we'll take a little bit more out. We'll just make it better and not necessarily perfect. Again, keep it nice and low. Now, how low? Here's the thing. When you are sharpening knives freehand, you can't be perfectly robotic in keeping a perfect angle for your back and forth motions. There's going to be a little bit of rocking in your body and your wrists. It's a little bit. This is an exaggeration. So given that there's a little bit of rocking in your body, it's better to be too low and right on rather than right on and too high. Because remember, anytime you come high up on that stone, you're undoing all that hard work that you're trying to accomplish. So I tell people that if you're getting some scratches on your secondary edge, when you're actually trying to grind in a new primary edge, then you're just about right. You know, one of the beauties The beautiful dividends of learning how to sharpen freehand is eventually you'll be able to sharpen anything, with anything, anywhere, at any time. Case in point, one time I was out in the garden, needed to sharpen up my neck knife, pulled up a 2x4 that had been buried in the mud for 2 years, and I used that mud-encrusted, mud-embedded 2x4 to sharpen my knife up. I was feeling pretty happy about that. Okay, so this one, we've accomplished step 5. We will put this aside right here. I know I've got lots of knives out here. And we'll do another knife. Let's see, oh, here's that buck folding knife that we ground the secondary edge on. Now, I'm going to subconsciously raise that just a little bit higher than I did this kitchen knife. Thicker blade, going to be used for possibly anything. We'll give it just a hair more angle, but well below what anyone else would think we ought to suggest. It'll still be a more of a cute angle than any other edge on any other folding knife out there. If the owner of this knife doesn't like his primary edge out in the field, he's welcome to go find his own river rock or mud encrusted 2x4 and change it. Who knows, maybe he even carries a set of stones in his truck. That's what I do. I carry one of these stones each in my truck, and then I can do a fine job of sharpening anywhere at any time. Nice low angle. Now guys, how do I know when to stop grinding in this primary edge? Yeah, that's right. I'm going to check it with my 3 fingers. Okay, I've got a new edge right here. Still a little slippery right back in there. So to preserve the longevity of this blade, to prevent, from grinding it away prematurely. I mean, theoretically, I could just grind until the blade's gone. Well, that would be a waste of the blade. That would be a waste of time and the blade. So I only need to go and continue grinding here in step 5, a primary edge, on those areas of the blade that are still slipping. I can feel, check again with my eyes, visually confirm. I'm almost there. Again, resist that temptation to raise it up too high. Okay, there we go. Okay, we've got a new primary edge on that one. This fella here, this Japanese cleaver, it's got some nicks in the edge, which when I was on step 3, I had already assessed. So we need to take those out. Now we take those out simply by raising it at that angle we want to. Now this is literally for chopping fish heads off and softer bones and things like that. So this would even raise up to even a higher angle. Maybe the kind of angle that most people establish their kitchen knife primary edges at. And I can feel on this stone that Japanese steel is really hard. It slides back and forth. Maybe you can even hear the difference. Something else I want you guys to observe. When I'm serious and sharpening knives and I'm doing kind of production style sharpening, I want you to look at my body, how it's a full body motion. See kind of how the motion kind of starts actually at my hips and the motion in my shoulders. I've developed this motion after having sharpened 50,000 knives. And this is a motion that I could maintain all day long with very little fatigue. In fact, my fingers in holding that blade hard will wear me out faster than the rest of my body will, just rocking back and forth. Okay, so 2 things I can check for here. I've just sharpened the one side, but I've sharpened so aggressively because I'm trying to remove some of those chips. I can actually feel from the back side here, and I can, oh look at that, I've even raised a burr. Right there on my middle finger is a little thread of steel. okay, that I've raised up, because I can feel I've raised a burr on the other side. I've actually curled the steel all the way around on the other side. Once you get there to that point, you can turn it around and sharpen the other side as well. Okay, in the case of a blade like this where I'm removing some edge damage, some pretty healthy chips, or in the case of like a serrated knife and you're trying to remove the serrations, when you're in step 5 and you're grinding in a new primary edge and you get it to where you want, you may notice that you've had to grind so much metal off of that thin primary edge that now the blade feels a little bit thicker than it should. You can always at this stage go back to step 4 and thin the blade down a little bit more. Maybe applying a little bit more pressure down towards the primary edge, so it's that area where you remove more metal from rather than back here. You see the difference? Towards the primary edge you remove material versus back towards the original blade thickness. Okay, that's 1, 2, 3. Oh, and let's see, we did this knife as well, so let's put a new primary edge on it. Again, I can see lots of areas where it's white. 3-finger test tells me, yep, it's pretty dull. Again, that round area there on that blade requires a bit of a, look, watch this hand. See how I'm having to rock that a little bit? Check. Check it. Check it. You know, in filming this video, I got so many knives out here, I honestly couldn't even remember whether I ground a primary edge on this already. But no, not to worry. All I have to do is check with my 3 fingers and I know exactly where I am with this knife. That's how useful that 3-finger test is. Let's continue on with our ambidextrous method here, just to show you that it can be done. You see, in essence, all sharpening is just removing a little bit of metal from knives to make them nice and angular. Thinning out the secondary edge as in step 4 and establishing a new primary edge in step 5. Step 6 and 7 is just going to refine what we're doing here. But in terms of just making a blade sharp, or definitely sharper, steps 5 will have you covered. Just a little bit more here. You see, this area here on this knife has gotten a lot of damage from probably, cutting those donuts on those ceramic plates and so on. And see, it's the tip that's taking the brunt of the force, because usually when people cut down on things, that's the part that takes the most damage. So it's also, on this knife, the part that's going to require the most effort to grind a new primary edge on. And there we go. Okay, so for you guys who are just learning, who haven't even had the chance to put a blade to the stone yet, how would you know? I'm telling you what the 3-finger test feels like, and with practice you'll learn it and you'll just know intuitively what I'm talking about. After the 10th or 20th knife that you've done this to, you'll know what I'm talking about. But what could you do in your kitchen or in your workshop when you're sharpening knives to test to see if you do have a new edge on a knife like this? Well, one thing you could do, as the old tomato test never fails, is get yourself a tomato or an apple or banana or kind of anything like that that's got a skin on it. And you could, under really light pressure, I'm not even letting the full weight of this blade touch the knife. I'm just kind of letting the blade touch, and I'm just kind of drawing it back. And this is just sliding on that skin. Let's see, how about this kitchen knife? That's just sliding on the skin. How about one of these knives that my fingers tell me I've established a new primary edge on? Okay, there it is. It just cut into the skin. There it's still sliding. There it's cutting. There it's cutting. Oh, here it's sliding a little bit. There finally cut. Okay, there it cut right in. Oh, look at this fella. It's sliding. And that's because the steel in this is so soft, is actually the burr has been pushed to one side. Yeah. How about this Japanese knife, this really super thick Japanese knife? Oh yeah, cut in right away. Okay, so something like this, you can see essentially what I've done with this tomato is essentially the same thing you're doing with your fingers, but of course you don't cut yourself. You can feel it just starts to cut, and that's when you stop. But you see, if a knife is dull, it'll just slide on that skin all day long, but most of these blades made cuts. In fact, seeing as I wasn't satisfied with this buck knife, let me go back and see if that's the burr that's just folded over on one side that's making it slide on the tomato skin, or if I have failed to establish. No, I've got an edge on there. Yeah, okay, yeah, it was just the burr. Soft steel knives will do that to you. Now how about this long knife here? Okay, cut in there, there cut, there it cut, there it cut. Right on the very tip, it's not cutting yet. And not there either. So let's work that just a bit more. Hopefully that is something you can use in conjunction with your three-finger test. As you're learning the three-finger test, see what an edge, the primary edge of a knife feels like when it'll slice right into a tomato skin like that, just under the weight of itself alone, with just minor drawing across the fingers. I'm going to show you something a little later which is going to be really strange. I'm going to show you a blade that'll shave hair off my arm and slice newspaper like there's no tomorrow that actually won't cut that tomato skin. And we'll explain why that is in a second. Okay. I'm actually kind of getting ahead of myself. You see me stropping this backwards, and that's actually step 6, and that's what really improves the performance of that primary edge, and that's why I'm eager to get on that step. Okay. Okay. I like to say okay. Gets me all psyched up for the next step. There we go. Again, resist that temptation to raise that spine up too high. Okay. Yeah, that's the burr, because I can feel it with my thumb when I push my finger that way. I can feel the burrs folded up. That's why it wasn't cutting into the tomato skin. Great. That sets us up perfectly for step 6. Step 6. Same stone, same blades, same angles. Now, where before we were going backwards and forwards on the stone, the problem is we can't establish a perfectly triangular primary edge on these knives because we're going backwards and forwards. Every time we pull that blade into and across that stone, that primary edge is bumping into stone particles metal particles, and any little imperfections and undulations on the stone. Basically, it's hitting obstacles. Imagine taking your blade out into your kid's sandbox and running it through edge first into a sandbox. What's going to happen? It's going to dull the blade. But do you know what would happen if you put your blade into a sandbox and moved it backwards hundreds of times? It would sharpen the blade. So to get the blade 5 times sharper using the same stone and using the same angle, we're going to strop backwards from tip to heel, from tip to heel, 5 times each side. You can do 5 times this way without changing hands, without changing your grip. That'll actually help you maintain a nice angle. Now when you get to step 6, you need to really slow down. This is where the precision really counts. And you can also try it ambidextrously. Again, the only thing you can do wrong here is, is like swoop the blade up and hit that primary edge on the stone or come off the edge of the stone. Just go slow and precise. Okay, now, oh yeah, now that edge feels so aggressive. It's perfectly angular. All the little edges all lined up. It cuts with the slightest, absolutely the slightest motion right into that tomato skin. That is as good as a primary edge as we can get on that stone. We come in with our buck knife here. Strop it 5 times each side. Again, for you beginner, go nice and slow and do 5 on one side before switching, like that. That'll allow you to control those angles better. Yeah, there we go. Yep, okay. Now onto this kitchen knife. Now this is a really soft knife. You see how it flexes? And if I push this here, see how it actually flexes on the stone? So actually when I'm doing the tip, I have to lighten the pressure just to make sure the blade is just in contact with the stone. And we'll let the stone do the work instead of me trying to power it through. When I'm in a hurry, I'll let my body speed up the process a little bit. But in essence, if your blade is in contact with the stone and it's moving, abrasion is happening. No need to speed it up. Yep, there we go. Yep, okay. Tip to heel, tip to heel. Of course, I don't recommend you carry a tomato around with you everywhere. This is just as you're learning, just until you can learn to trust the feedback that your 3 fingers give you, okay? Don't ever forget that thumb on the back. That's your safety. And when you show this technique to others, they'll see you do it and you try to show them how it's done, and then they start doing this because they didn't pick up on the idea that you need your thumb in the back, and they can get dangerous. So make sure if you ever show this to other people, because it's a neat thing to show people, that they have the thumb on the back of their finger. Okay, there it is. This blade is so soft that that burr, until we remove it, it's not going to show good cutting performance on that tomato skin. Happily and conclusively, we're now finally at step 7. Now it's really important, guys, that you slow down for steps 4, 5, and 6. Because if you've done a sloppy job on those, if you're not getting that biting sensation in your fingers with the 3-finger test of edge sharpness, and if it won't cut into something like a tomato skin, then all of the stropping and honing on the 6,000 stone in the world isn't going to improve things. It's just not abrasive enough. If you have to, go back to that 1,000 or to your rough stone and keep working until you get that good primary edge. But we've tested all these knives and we know we're ready. So at this stage, we don't do anything with the angles, and we're not going to be going back and forth. All we're going to be doing is that trailing type stropping motion, the honing of the primary edge from tip to heel, tip to heel. It only takes 5 strokes on each side. Now this is where we can really improve things. We're going to get rid of the burr that's on the edge. Burrs are little pieces of metal that are mostly abraded off, but they're holding on for dear life because the blades have been tempered properly, and every time we flip sides, that burr's flipping from one side to the other. It's really hard to get it off. So what we do is, under the weight of the blade itself, we draw it through a piece of wood. Once or twice or 3 times, you'll feel it's kind of gritty the first time, it feels smooth the second time, smoother the third time. I'm not trying to cut that piece of wood in half, just trying to knock the burr off. And we'll come in and we'll strop once on one side and alternatively on each side. Nice and slow and nice and soft. The closer you get to finishing, the softer you can do it. Okay, now my 3 fingers are telling me that this is now a scary sharp edge. And the hairs on my arm are confirming so. They're shaving off. And on the tomato skin, cuts right in, with the littlest of motion. And finally, with a piece of newsprint, I got some shaving there. There is still wasn't shaving as good as I'd like it. So following my own advice, we will drop back to step 6 and to carefully stropping that edge again on the 1000 grit stone. Again, step 7, stropping. I mean, we were so close, we shaved hair off our arm and it cut into the tomato skin. I just like to have everything as perfect as possible since we've gone through all this effort. There. Let's see if that's any better. Okay, good. Well, I'm glad we persevered and got that one just exactly the way we wanted it. Okay, so that one's good to go. Now, how about the buck knife? Same deal. Again, you can do as I say here and not do as I do. You can do 5 strokes on one side to keep things consistent before flipping it over. I'm trying to tell you to do one thing and 50,000 knives and all that muscle memory is trying to make me do something different order. Okay, there's the edge through the wood. Boy, that's really cutting aggressively into the wood. That's another way you can tell your progress is when you're knocking that burr off. You can really feel the difference between a super keen, acute, well-established edge into that wood. Now, because this was a softer stainless steel, I'm going to try to work a little harder getting that burr off. The harder steels, the burr comes off right away. The softer steels, sometimes you got to work at it. Some blades are so soft, like some of the kitchen knives are so soft, that if I actually create a burr by doing a trailing stroke, I actually can almost never get rid of the burr. There are some blades that are so soft, I actually have to cut into that 1000 grit stone in order to have the burr kind of fold over and get pinched off between the blade and the stone. That's kind of an advanced technique, but in dire emergencies, sometimes that's the only way you can get rid of the burr. Okay, there's our buck knife. Well, little buddy, let's see what you're made of. Okay, cutting immediately into the tomato skin, 3 fingers telling me scary sharp. Hair in the arms all popping off. Okay, let's see what this little difficult piece of newspaper is going to tell me. Here we go. Okay, cuts the newspaper just fine. I got 2 out of 2. Okay, kitchen knife. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Remember, keep that stone flushed off. Use nice light pressure. You're getting near the finish. Everything needs to be precise. 1, 2, 1, 2, knocking the burr off. Now, when you're knocking the burr off, use a spare piece of wood. Don't start using Mama's kitchen counter, okay? Gotta keep the piece around the house. There's one. Okay, 3 fingers are telling me we have success. Tomato skins telling me we have great success. Oh yeah. And this little stubborn piece of newspaper, let's see how it does. Ooh, look at that. Now what we actually have there, can you hear it go chop, 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 chop? Is there still little microscopic nicks in the blade from the original damage that was there. Now I could have kept sharpening to get those out, you see, and that's where sometimes the newspaper test doesn't tell you the full story, doesn't show you the full picture. You know, as far as in the kitchen, you can see that cuts right into that tomato skin. 3 fingers feel fine and shaves, but the newspaper was a little bit yeah. Well, here's where you get to see the difference in the metallurgy and in the original condition of the blades. Well, you could really hear the difference there. That first pass through the wood was so gritty, and the second one was so smooth. That's all the burr getting knocked off. You can just see how deliberate, how slow I go as we finish up. You know, steps 4 and 5, you can kind of muscle your way through and hurry as you gain experience. But once you get to step 6 and 7, you really need to slow it down and be as precise as you can. Okay, well, the 3-finger test tells me we're where we need to be. The tomato skin test tells me, confirms that. Look at that, a little bit of sliding action right there. What's going on there? Okay, so we had that one section there that wasn't quite cutting that tomato, so this is where we've got to go, all the way back to step 5. Grind, make sure we're grinding in the primary edge. It's not going to take much. I saw the faintest line, but you got to keep working it until you get it. Sometimes this is what being a master is all about, is being willing to go back and correct any mistakes you make along the way. Fortunately, we have a system for diagnosing. Okay, I feel I'm there in that one little section. We'll come right into step 6 and strop that backwards, lightening up on the pressure, going nice and slow, getting it precise, and now we're back to step 7. See, it didn't take that long even to backtrack by 2 steps. Coming in step 7 here. Strop. Now, by the way, we've just worked on 4 knives here. That little buck folding knife, that Japanese cleaver, the kitchen paring petty knife, and this 8-inch slicer. This is a way I recommend for you guys actually to learn how to master sharpening, is work on a batch of knives. The advantage is that you get into the swing of things. You grind that secondary edge, as in step 4, and you grind one knife, then you grind the other, then you grind the other. You start to get really in the swing of things. You look back to the first one you did, you see that you could have improved a little bit, you do a little bit more, and then you move a whole batch of knives through the steps. You'll make progress a lot faster than if you work on one knife from start to completion. One knife, start to completion. Work in batches. That's been my strategy in business. You know, the way I've made 16,000 knives in 24 years is I work in knives of, 25 to 50 knives, even sometimes batches of 100. And it allows me to get into the swing or the groove of each specific step I'm doing. Sometimes when I'm making knives, there can be as many as 65 steps from start to finish. But it also means that as I'm working on a step, if I catch one knife where I say, oh, I need to do this more, chances are I can go back and check them all and then improve on all of them to bring them all up to snuff. So working on batches of knives is a great way to do it. I just wouldn't suggest a batch so big that it seems like you never make progress, because you'll become disheartened and you'll give up. So make sure it's you bite off a chunk that you can chew. Okay, so burrs. Okay, well, to my 3 fingers, it feels razor sharp. To the tomato skin, we got to cut there, There's a part that wasn't cutting before, it's cutting now. Now, it doesn't quite cut as aggressively as other places. You know, sometimes that's reflective of the metallurgy. Sometimes, by the nature of the way the blades are heated and then quenched and then tempered, you could have some places in the blade that are a little harder than others and a little softer than the others. I'm suspecting we got one spot here on this little knife where maybe it was left on a burner on a stove once, and then maybe it got a little hot, or maybe it was maybe when it was made there was a soft spot there. Who knows? But definitely, I've gone and I've established that primary edge, stropped it and honed it, and it's razor sharp everywhere except for that one spot, although it'll cut. And that's just the relative metallurgy of the blade. That's the only conclusion you can come to. See how exciting sharpening with stones is? You learn about the metallurgy in blades. There it cuts. And again, when it gets up to that, right up to that tip there, yeah, I can notice a cutting difference in, I can notice a difference in the cutting performance of this blade, but we have successfully finished this knife. There's only one last aspect to step 7, and that is, how do you make the blade look pretty now and polish up the blade after you've ground in that secondary edge in step 4. And what you do at this point is you put that flat, you put any of these knives flat on your finished stone, and you grind back and forth on the secondary edge. This won't make them any sharper. We're finished sharpening them for now. All we're doing is we're polishing them up. You do a little bit on one side, clean your stone off, polish up the other side, and you're done. Now, to show you just how pretty this can be, because this buck knife is mostly hollow, you can kind of see here where I've polished up the 2 high spots. But let me get my little neck knife out here, which I'm fond of using. Okay, it just so happens that I've got one side here that's really gray from the 1000 grit stone. In fact, I'll make sure it's completely gray. This is the secondary edge. This is step 4. Just make sure it's nice and gray, nice and thinned out. See, my neck knives start out as a hollow grind, but after 2 or 3, maybe 5 or 6 sharpenings, they become flat like that. Now, watch before and after. This looks so pretty, guys, when you polish up the secondary edge on a fine finishing stone like this 6000 grit king stone that we sell. And being careful to keep all the scratches in the same direction. I'm not going this way and then this way and then this way. I'm just going backwards and forwards. I'm almost done. See, that just takes no time at all. Yeah, look at that. That is so attractive. See, can you see in the light? Can you see that now? Really nice. And I could have spent a little bit more time and even make it a little bit more pretty, but that's the idea, is when you pull a knife out like this, and show it to your buddies, or you get guests over and they come and look at your knives in the kitchen, they can see this. They can see that this knife looks different than any other knife they've looked at. And what that is the evidence of your tender, loving care, is your skill will be apparent to them, that you have straightened this knife, you've cleaned it, you've assessed it for damages, which is step 3, you've thinned out the secondary edge, you've ground in a new primary edge, you've honed that primary edge, and then you finished it with a 6,000 grit stone, which was step 7. That, guys, is the 7-step procedure of knife sharpening. We've done it 3 or 4 times now. And now I need you to go into your shop, get yourself a good set of sharpening stones, and go practice, because I know you can master it. We're going to do a really fun experiment now. I want to show you besides the obvious importance of having sharp knives because they're safer, and it allows you to do all of your cutting chores and tasks with speed, efficiency, and even with a deal of pleasure. I'm going to show you, in terms of preparing food, why it is so important to have really sharp knives. We're going to cut this apple in 3 different pieces. We will cut 1/2 with a knife that's come straight out of my friend's kitchen. You know, that looks like it might do a good job of cutting. It's just like any other kitchen knife you'd pick up. And we'll cut the other half with this knife that we just sharpened. Okay, first, the half with what I'm going to tell you is a dull kitchen knife. I mean, I can look at the edge. I can see it's dull. I can do the 3-finger test of edge sharpness. It's dull. Tomato skin, even with pressure. Okay, there it finally went. So it's a dull knife. Here, let's cut this apple. Okay, some things we notice about this cut surface of this apple. It's really rough looking. There's a bunch of juice here in that little cut section there. Of course, it didn't even cut all the way through. In fact, it looks like we kind of got a cut here, and it kind of looks like it just tore the rest of the way. But that's with a dull knife. See how I had to saw that through? So we're going to leave this part of this apple with a dull knife. Now, we're going to flip it over, cut the other side with this knife that we just sharpened. Okay. When you notice this cut surface, especially this side, you can see how dry it looks, you know, compared to this piece, which looks all juicy. Well, what's happened here is there's actually been less cell damage in this part of the apple, whereas a dull knife kind of ripped through and tore and crushed the cells. This cut through them relatively cleanly, producing less juice and less tear and less rip out. So we'll put this with this knife, and this with this knife, and this part we'll put away. And we're going to come back to this in about 15 minutes, and we're going to see what happens to the surface of this apple, dull and sharp. While we're waiting for these apples to do what they're going to do here over time, let me take the opportunity to quickly show you how I'm going to refurbish the tip of a knife. We've talked about it. It's a really important assessment in step 3 of the 7-step procedure of knife sharpening, but let me show you the mechanics of how we fix a knife tip. Okay, well, there aren't many more glaring examples of a broken knife tip than something like this. However, be of good cheer. This is easily, on a thin knife like this is easily remedied with a little bit of elbow grease and a little bit of know-how. Again, according to the step 7 procedures, we're going to clean, check for straightness, and assess. Our assessment is the tip's broken, and so now we need to grind it out. What I need to do when you're fixing a broken tip, it's a principle I call the last molecule principle. Somewhere along that flat, broken surface, I have to decide in my head that there's one molecule of steel that's sitting there right now that will still be there when the sharpening process is over. And that molecule will be the tip of the knife. So I want to sharpen away everything else on either side of that molecule. Now, if that last molecule is right up here, on this far right-hand side, then everything on the left-hand side has to come off up to it. If it's down low, basically right where the cutting edge, the primary edge, intersects where that break is, then I've got to grind metal off of the back. And if I decide it's going to be somewhere in the middle, then I'm going to be grinding metal off, both off the cutting primary edge side and off the spine side. So in this case, I'm going to say I'm going to leave the back just the way it is and grind everything off up to it. So there'll be actually more of a round, tip here. So I got to grind and watch and grind and watch and see what I'm doing. I'm back to my 1000 grit stone here. And this is one of those jobs that if it feels overwhelming, if you work at it at 10 minutes, I say give it a break. Go and do something that's pleasant to you and relax your arms and relax your shoulders and your hands, and come back in a different time and do another 10 minutes of work on it. Now here's something else too, is what you can't see is the heat that would build up between moving metal quickly against an abrasive medium like a stone. Of course, the water is what's cooling this blade. But if you tried to use a piece of mechanized equipment like some kind of a grinder, or maybe a bench grinder, or a belt grinder, or a belt sander, you run the danger of heating that steel up so quickly because of the friction that you're going to negatively affect the temper. If any time you grind steel with mechanized power and you see that steel turn to like a yellow, to a vermilion, to a blue color, you've just negatively affected the temper. And just like that long slicing knife that I was sharpening earlier, that seemed to be really sharp in some sections, and there was one section that I just couldn't get to be razor sharp. You know, heat is the culprit. Just like an apple pie. Everything's time and temperature. You cook an apple pie in the oven for too long at too high of a temperature, no one's going to want to eat that apple pie. When knives are being made, it's also all a factor of time and temperature. And if the steel is ever heated up past a certain point in either the annealing, quenching, or tempering process, you're going to negatively affect the performance of the steel. Okay, let me show you just how much progress we've made already. We are currently halfway, or that fracture is half as much as it used to be just a few minutes ago. So you can see we've made great progress. Okay, well you can see we're at a good 2/3 of the way there. In fact, at first glance, you know, that looks like a normal knife now. That broken tip no longer seems to inhibit the use of the knife like it did before. But we can get it absolutely perfect. We can get it to the point where it's what we call thumbtack sharp. What I call thumbtack sharp means that when you kind of lightly touch your thumb to that point, the point of that knife will kind of pick up the skin of your thumb pad, of your thumb print, like a thumbtack would, you know, like a tack that you'd use to put a poster on a wall. You notice also that it doesn't look angular. I've been kind of blending it all in and grinding basically from here all the way up to the tip so that it looks aesthetically pleasing. I've been keeping my eye on these apples here, and in just this little while we can already see, we'll show you in a bit, we can already see how the apples are starting to change color. The one cut with the dull knife is visibly browner on a cut surface than the one cut with the sharper knife. Again, great opportunity to use all the high spots of your stone. Okay, well, remember what comes after all that grinding? The stropping. This was going to be step 6, remember? Now, when I'm stropping, in order to get that point thumbtack sharp, I'm going to strop by starting just behind that last molecule. Remember that last molecule principle. We're trying to keep that one last molecule right there where that break was, and we're trying to grind everything else off. That means we're going to grind right behind that last molecule. Another thing I can do here, and we'll show you on the finish 6,000 grit stone, according to the 7th step, is we'll actually watch a trail of metal come off on the stone. There we go. Watch as I transition to this stone. Let me clean it off for you so we get a real clear view of what's happening. There we go. Okay. Now watch carefully. As I draw this stone backwards, watch where you can see the metal. You can see the metals coming about a 1/4 inch from the tip. Now watch as I circulate, as I rotate it up. There it is, an 1/8 from the tip, 16th, 64th, and I'm going to keep coming closer and closer to the tip without actually doing the tip. Isn't that neat? You can actually see me come closer and closer and closer to that tip. I'll go backwards. There we go. There we go. Isn't that neat? Okay. Now, there it is. You can hear it. It just grabs the pad of your finger. So there it is. We now have a nicely repaired tip. You remember how broken that was. That's a nice repair job. Keep it rolling. Now, just to show you, this is just for giggles, to show you guys just how well these techniques work, no matter what the sharpening medium. Now you keep in mind, I've been using the Japanese water stones. I think they're the best and they're the fastest and they give you the most predictable results. That doesn't mean they're the only thing that you can use. I'll use anything that's on hand. If I don't have my Japanese stones, if I'm at somebody's house, I'll find what they have. I'll use the backside of a toilet lid cover if I have to. I use the backside of cups. I use sidewalks. I use, mud embedded 2x4s if I have to. But now what we're going to do is we're going to use this piece of concrete. We have to use it any way we can get. Look at it, it's all moldy and everything. It came straight out of the garden. So we're going to do a test here. Okay, here's a knife out of the friend's kitchen, another one. Look at that, really dull. Even has some edge damage. Looking in the light, it's super, super flat up here. So let me see if this cinder block will scratch this blade. Here it is, previous. Let me clean it up real quick. That way we'll be able to see the if it scratches or not. Polish it up first. Being careful not to cut myself. Okay. Don't want to get any Comet Cleanser on my tomato there. It's my $2.99 a pound organic tomato. I better. That fella's going to get eaten later. Okay, here we go. Nice clean surface. Ooh, like fingernails on a chalkboard. Okay, well, I can see scratches on the blade. That's good news, because if we can scratch the steel, that means we can sharpen it. It's going to require a bit of work, but we're going to follow the same steps. Clean, check for straightness, assess what we need to do. I'm going to thin it a little bit and I'm going to establish a new primary edge. We're going to see if we can't get this edge to shave hair off my arm off of a cinder block. Okay, so we start with the secondary edge. Now, if you didn't have water, you could do this dry. The only thing is, you have to watch out for heat buildup. You just can't go very fast when you do it dry. Did you see this thing? It even has little flowers growing in it. This came right out of my garden. You know, this sounds better than the last time I did it. Last time I did it dry. Boy, did that sound bad. Okay, do you remember what step this was? Adjusting the blade thickness, grinding that secondary edge. That was step 4. So we're going to leave it at that. We're going to go into step 5 now. Step 5 was grinding in a new primary edge. And I have to lift the spine of that blade up. How much? Depends on my experience. You know, it depends on what I want to cut with that knife. Yes, sir. I can just see people of third world nations, you know, without the proper tools. I bet a lot of blades get sharpened on pieces of concrete and river rocks. And, you know, if you have 2 rocks, you can always rub one rock against the other until you get a semi-flat surface. And that's another way you can create a sharpening medium when there isn't anything better. Okay. Yep, it's coming along. Halfway there. Now, the bumpier your sharpening medium is, the more a stropping or edge trailing stroke is going to work for you. You know, every time you go forward into a bumpy surface like that, again, your edge is bumping into all those obstacles. So my fingers are telling me, wow, my fingers are telling me I've established a new primary edge. So this is now time to move on to step 6, which is just the stropping or edge trailing. Try to keep that surface flush with water. If you're lucky, the grinding of the secondary edge and grinding of a new primary edge will kind of flatten out and work your sharpening surface in here a little bit. Here we go. Now, oh yeah. Still have a little bit of edge damage there. Oh, I can see a little bit of white. A little bit, is that a burr? No, I don't quite have that secondary edge on there, or primary, sorry. Let me grind a little more. I thought it was going a little too easy. Usually this is I'm gonna work at this. I'll start removing the burr a little early because it's a really large and irregular burr. There we go. Okay. I've definitely established a primary edge. Now, we could use a bit of newspaper or cardboard as our final hone. The cardboard and newspaper have a lot of basically clay added to it to fill in all the voids between the wood fibers, and consequently it allows it to be fairly abrasive. That's why when you cut cardboard or newspaper with scissors or with a knife, it dulls it pretty quickly. But whatever will dull a knife will also sharpen it. This will dull a knife. This will sharpen a knife. Okay? It's all about direction. Okay, so we'll cut ourselves a little stropping surface here and see what we can do. Is this our knife? No. This one. Here we go. Oh yeah. So this would be like step 7, where we used our fine 6,000 grit stone instead of we're using a piece of cardboard. Turn that fella around. Knock the burr off again. Should we check her on the tomato? See what she does with the tomato? There it is. Cuts right in. Yep. Cuts into the tomato. There it is. You can see she saved some hair. Certainly not like the other knives we sharpen on the proper stones, but she cuts tomato and cuts hair just with a cinder block and with cardboard. It's not your optimum sharpening medium, but you can do it in a pinch. Okay, now what really allowed that to happen was the back strokes. Now let me show you all those other sharpening devices which you may have at home, and let's talk briefly on how you might get the maximum use out of them. Okay, we just demonstrated that by using that step 6, the backward stropping motion on stones, we could get a knife sharp even on a cinder block. Well, how would you use this? A traditional butcher steel. If you had a butcher steel, they're not very good at grinding metal away, but they will do a little bit of a touch-up on a primary edge. But they won't bring a primary edge that's completely dull back into condition. You need to establish first that you have a primary edge on a knife before you can use any of the sharpening devices that I'm going to show you. If you were using a butcher steel and you had already established a primary edge, or if you were just trying to touch it up in the kitchen, rather than cut down into your butcher steel, you're going to get the greatest benefit by actually stropping up, or hold it in here and stropping away from you. You see what I'm doing? It's mimicking the step 6 in our 7-step procedure. You're doing the trailing edge stroke, and it'll always make whatever kind of edge you had on there sharper, and as sharp as it'll be with that sharpening medium. Okay, well, how about with one of these sharpening devices with the base and the ceramic sticks? Same thing. If you're going to use this system, if it's all you had, rather than cutting into your sharpening medium, the better technique would be to stroke backwards like this on both sides. Now, that brings us to a problem with the ceramics. This is a brand new ceramic rod. It's a modern replacement for the traditional butcher steel. And the idea here is that ceramic is many times harder than steel, and it'll abrade the steel away. Let's see. Okay, as is evidenced by the fact that we just left a whole big streak of steel on that ceramic. Well, let's try it over here. And how about in the middle of that? And over here as well, and over here. Okay, well, we're soon going to run into a problem. And that problem is that ceramics are notorious for loading up with steel like that. And they don't just easily wash off. See, even I scrubbed that, it didn't wash off. Not like the traditional Japanese water stones. Look at the difference. Here's a traditional Japanese water stone, and off comes the steel. The ceramics, they load up. And after they load up, they don't cut very well anymore, because basically the little pores in the abrasive have filled up with steel. So you got two sides. You fill up this side, then you fill up this side, and basically you're now out of commission. There are ways that they recommend that you clean the ceramic out, but it's so time consuming and so labor intensive that it's just not a very good bargain. If that's all you have, then you can make the most out of it. And you'll always make the most out of it by stropping backwards. Now, what about these little devices here that we looked at way earlier in the video? In fact, if I look in here, it's got little ceramic rods in there, and already those ceramic rods are loaded up with steel particles. However, there's no way you can get in there to wash those out or to clean them out. Same deal with this sharpening system here. Not only does it only utilize or address the primary edge, but once those ceramics load up, there's absolutely no way of looking after them. We already talked about the deficiency of diamond hones, and that is that A, diamonds are so much harder than steel that even if you try to just lightly burnish the edge, like as in step 6, those diamonds cut really deep furrows in the edge of the blade. And when an edge fails, usually it's where those deep furrows are that the little carbides or the edge basically breaks and chips off. But if this is all you had, again, you're always going to get better results by stropping backwards than by stropping forwards or by cutting into the stone. So that's how you can use any other medium out there. And I was kind of half-jokingly said you could use the lid of the toilet reservoir, and you can if there's exposed ceramic on there. But again, you would do that by bringing the edge backwards. I've used the bottom of a ceramic plate, the bottom of a coffee cup, river stones. I even one time polished a blade by pulling ashes out of the fire and rubbing them into the bark of a tree and stropping backwards that way. And the silica and the ashes abraded some steel away and made it sharp. Again, anytime you're on a questionable surface, you always stropping backwards will always give you a sharper edge. Now, speaking of edges, we're almost to the end of our video, but I did want to show you this. This is almost a mystery in the world of knives, and we started out this way, but I want to conclude this way as well. Is here we have a knife that's razor sharp, cuts newspaper really well, and yet watch what I do here. I'm making my fingers white, rubbing them back and forth in the blade. Now my fingers aren't calloused up, as some people say, oh Murray, you do it all the time, you got tough fingers. No, my fingers are made of flesh and blood like yours. It's just that this edge has been stropped so heavily on a leather strop that microscopically the tip of that blade, instead of looking angular, it actually looks like the tip of a ballpoint pen. And I can rub my fingers along that with ease. It's not until that edge is stropped and honed on the stones as for step 5 and step 6, and then step 7, will that start to feel scary sharp. And when it feels scary sharp, it will just cut right into that tomato. See the way that is now? It's actually gliding. Look at that. I'm not lifting it up. It's actually on the tomato skin. It glided all the way down, and that's a blade that shaves hair. Interesting, huh? Okay, well, the very last thing for us to look at before we send you out to the shop to try practice sharpening yourself is this apple. Can you guess which side was cut with a dull knife? Yep, you're right. The one I'm holding in my right hand, that was cut with a dull knife. And the one in my left hand was cut with a sharp knife. So you can see how much faster food starts to degrade when it's cut with a dull knife. Well, folks, I hope you benefited from this demonstration. I hope you benefited from the Blade Sharpening Fundamentals DVD that we filmed here today. It's been long. There's a lot of information for you to assimilate. But just don't forget that 7-step procedure for knife sharpening. And don't forget the 3-finger test of edge sharpness. That's really going to be your gauge, your barometer, so to speak, to gauge your progress as you learn your sharpening. You'll know when your knife is ready for each subsequent stage based on the results you get with your 3 fingers. Remember to always keep your angles low and be persistent, because the hard work pays off. You can master hand sharpening. This is Murray Carter from Carter Cutlery. God bless you all. If you've enjoyed this blade sharpening presentation, you're sure to enjoy advanced blade sharpening techniques. In this video, we pick up where we left off with blade sharpening fundamentals, covering such sensitive topics like how to properly fix a tanto blade, or how to straighten blades, what to do with serrated blades, defining points, using mechanized grinding equipment, etc. This is exactly where you want to pick up once you've made an in-depth study of blade sharpening fundamentals. Also, now that you've got sharp knives, what are you going to do with them? Well, here's a great idea. This new video series, Kitchen Cuts, is a 10-part series where we've isolated each different kitchen knife, paring knife and the nakiri bocho and French-style chef's knife, slicing knives, cleavers, petty knives, etc. This is part 1. This is part 2. There will be 10 parts in the series. And this is going to show you what you can do with your super sharp chef's knives now. Of further interest to the ardent sharpening and bladesmithing student, Bladesmithing with Murray Carter. It's a in-depth study of the traditional Japanese bladesmithing techniques and their modern application. If reading a book isn't enough for you and you still have insatiable curiosity and a desire to make your own knives, then what could be better than attending one of Carter Cutlery's traditional Japanese bladesmithing school classes? We have over 13 different classes ranging from 1 day to 6 days, ranging from making a neck knife or a kitchen knife all the way up to sword forging. The bladesmithing classes are a great way to get your hands dirty and really learn all about blade making and blade sharpening. If you're just curious for some more information, you can email us at murray@cartercutlery.com and request your own free copy of our 20-page color catalog and a free shop tour DVD. Focus up.
Okay. So we got section 7, part 7, 7.
Step 7.
Step 7. Take 3. Clapper, 3, 2, 1.
Hey, could you ever break that? They're not. Grit stone won't correct a problem. It's just not abrasive enough. You need everything to be set up.
Yeah, well, we'll cancel.
No, we'll just keep going unless there's light. If there's light,
No, that all came through your microphone.
I see. Yeah, but can't we just pick it up and start roll again? I want to do that on something else. I guess I'll have to do it here. Because that looks hokey.
Okay, just keep everything rolling.
Yeah, yeah.
There you
Got
go.
it. Hey. I cut my fingers off.
Put that sheet in half.